Hello and welcome to the next video in my Theories of IR series. So this time we'll be looking at Constructivism, which, as I mentioned in the previous video, has a lot of common ground with the last paradigm that we looked at, which of course was critical theory. So Constructivism is kind of coming from a different tradition. It's not based in kind of the Marxian tradition in the way that critical theory is, but nonetheless it makes a lot of very, very similar points. So first of all, this is important to kind of get your head around where constructivists are coming from. Let's kind of return to talking about methodology. Now, once again, students are often not keen on methodology. They're kind of not sure of what this term means, and that's a kind of a normal thing. If you're kind of a little bit at sea in terms of understanding methodology and what that means, you're not alone. It's very, very common, particularly for new IR students, to kind of have a bit of trouble at first getting their head around methodology and what it means. But basically, our methodology refers to our approach to building theory, and our methodology is based ultimately on our epistemology, which is another kind of big word, but ultimately what we mean is our philosophical understanding of how do we go about building knowledge. In simple terms, how do we know what we think we know? How do we go about building valid knowledge? What is valid knowledge, and how do we go about creating valid knowledge? And our underlying philosophy regarding that is the starting point for our epistemology, and ultimately for our methodological approach to creating IR theory. So we've kind of already touched on this in some of the earlier videos. So we said that the early IR theories, so we're talking particularly classical realism and classical liberalism, were coming from a kind of historical inquiry methodological approach. So the first IR scholars from 1919 up to kind of the middle of the 20th century were essentially historians. I think it's fair to say that IR, to a very large extent, grew out of history, the discipline of history. And the first IR people were essentially historians, and their approach to building knowledge of IR was essentially the historical inquiry method, the same approach that historians use. So in other words, kind of building arguments based upon presenting evidence and arguing a case based upon that. So that was kind of the approach up until the kind of the middle of the 20th century, and at that point then, as we've mentioned in previous videos, the positivist approach started to become dominant in IR as well as other social sciences, and indeed this is kind of the point when IR started to be thought of as a social science. Again, as opposed to a humanities extension of history kind of subject. So positivism again kind of means the idea that we can build scientific theory, that there is one truth, basically, that there is this kind of one truth about the human world, and our job as scholars essentially is to uncover that truth through logical deduction, through reasoning and deduction, through not so much experimentation, because obviously IR is not a subject where we can't have an experimental nuclear war, for example, but certainly through gathering data, particularly kind of numerical and statistical data, crunching numbers, but also using logic and reasoning and working out the rules, the underlying rules and principles under which the world operates. So again, just as the natural world operates to a kind of set of known principles and laws, so again, if we look at physics, for example, physics is kind of based on measuring and gaining understanding of the natural kind of physical world, and deducing the natural laws which kind of govern the operation of the natural world, and building theory based on that data. And positivism is basically the idea that we can do the same in the human world, and that international relations operates to a set of laws, a set of principles. Again, there is one truth, there is one set of facts. Our job is to find out what they are. So the positivist approach underpinned neorealism and also neoliberal institutionalism. Post-positivism kind of came to the fore in the 1980s, late 1980s onwards, kind of end of the Cold War period through to the present day. And post-positivists kind of challenge the idea that there is one single truth, that there is such a thing as objective truth. Rather, post-positivists argue that there are multiple truths, that the truth, in many respects, the truth is a point of view. And so post-positivists kind of seek to embrace this and to capture a wider range of voices and viewpoints and understandings of the world. They tend to be very focused, again, as we talked about in the previous video, on critical theory. They tend to be very focused on the role of ideas, and the role of values and perceptions and understandings and beliefs in creating and sustaining power structures and unequal kind of relationships, and patterns of domination and subordination and so on. Post-positivist approaches tend to be explicitly normative, i.e. they seek to challenge existing understandings of the world in order to ultimately bring about emancipation from these unequal power structures. So post-positivist approaches tend to be, they tend to be explicitly normative. They tend to see the purpose of theory as being to challenge injustices, and to offer alternative perspectives which can liberate the oppressed from these unequal power relationships, which are based ultimately in dominant cultures and dominant ideologies. So that's essentially where post-positivists are coming from. So again, it's kind of a philosophical question, and I'm not going to tell you what to think here. I mean, ultimately, it's something I think that you need to consider for yourself, but it's an interesting philosophical question. Can we as researchers stand aside from the social world and view it objectively as positivists assume? So positivists see IR scholars as being social scientists, essentially following the same methodology as natural scientists, that again we can stand on neutral ground, we can stand apart from the world, we can observe the world from a kind of neutral viewpoint and work out how the world works, again from a neutral perspective. Is that really the case? is there a single objective truth that we can analyse and understand, or is truth a point of view? Again, the answer to that question is important for determining our fundamental approach to IR theory, but it's a question that I think each of us need to consider for ourselves. So we'll come across, when we talk about constructivism, we'll come across the term social construct quite a lot. So we need to consider what we mean by this term social construct. And essentially by social construct we mean an understanding of reality which exists ultimately in the mind, but not something that we necessarily construct for ourselves as individuals. Social constructs are created collectively as a group through shared ideas, through ongoing discourse, discussion. We collectively share a set of values and cultural beliefs and norms and understandings, and we create our own reality out of those. To illustrate, I mean that's kind of a bit of an abstract point, but to kind of illustrate, think of something like money, for example. Now, money in a sense is not objectively real. I don't have a note on me at the moment. When I do this in class, I often kind of show my students a note, and you know, and obviously we all kind of agree that this note has value, this banknote has value. I can go into a shop, I can exchange it for goods, I can exchange it for services. Well, it may not be a banknote, maybe I'm using my plastic, maybe I'm using my my credit card or my debit card, or maybe I'm using electronic means of another electronic means of payment like Apple Pay or Google Pay or the like. But whatever form it takes, we kind of agree that money exists and that each of us has a certain quantity of it, some have more than others, and that we can exchange this for goods and services, and therefore it has value. But really, money only exists because we all agreed that it does. I mean, that banknote is just a piece of paper, or these days plastic. In actual fact, in the UK we've gone over to plastic notes. But anyway, it's just a piece of paper or plastic. It's not in itself any particular use for anything. It doesn't have intrinsic value. It only has value because we all agree that it does. We all collectively agree that this thing called money exists, and because we act as though it exists, then therefore it exists. But ultimately, money is an idea, it's a concept. It's not something which is objectively real, even though it's very important to society, to capitalist society, to the way that we live. Money is pretty fundamental. So I'm not saying that money is not important. Just because it's a social construct doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, or that it's not important, or that we shouldn't care about it. Of course, it's a very important part of the reality in which we live, but it illustrates how that reality is, to a large extent, created out of shared ideas, and money is one of these. Okay, so a social construct is an idea, notion or understanding about the social world that is created by society, not so much by individuals acting individually, by kind of collectively. And this is, not an objective reality or a law of nature, if you like. So we mentioned money, but we could also talk about things like gender. Again, that's a slightly controversial one. Is gender an objective reality or not? Again, I don't want to kind of get into that debate, but I would say that we need to, my own personal view is that we need to separate gender from biological sex. Biological sex is, is ultimately about chromosomes, and X and Y chromosomes are a biological reality, not a social construct. However, gender roles and ideas about gender, those are something that are socially constructed. Nationality, again, socially constructed. What does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be an American or French or Indian or Chinese, or whatever your national identity is? Where does that come from? Is it something that is objectively real, or is it something which is shared? And I would say that it is a shared identity. A nation is ultimately it's a group of people with a shared collective national identity. And even things like the state itself and sovereignty, for example, these things ultimately are, socially constructed. They're not objectively real. So, if we look at, for example, the Soviet Union, why did the Soviet Union cease to exist? Because ultimately people stopped believing in it. And national identities as Russians and Ukrainians and Georgians and Belarusians and so on were stronger than kind of the Soviet identity. And the Soviet state, which had seemed to be so powerful, this authoritarian state which had been so powerful for so many decades, ultimately collapsed almost overnight back in 1991, simply because people stopped believing in it, which illustrates the fact that even the state is ultimately a social construct. Realists treat it as a given, even liberals kind of treat it as a given, as a kind of an immutable part of the system, but it is, it is not something which is part of nature. It's something that we create. Ultimately, the state is just a shared idea, like any other social construct. So again, these constructs are obviously widely accepted within the society, and we accept them as kind of natural features of the system, kind of assume that they've always been there and always will be there, but in fact they are just an invention of the society. They haven't always existed. They may not always continue to exist outside of that society. And compare that to what critical theorists are saying as well, making similar points. So social constructs ultimately change over time. They are not static. They do evolve over time. So again, the idea of the Westphalian sovereign state, really only, as we understand it today, I mean, there were kind of earlier forms of state, but the Westphalian sovereign state, as we understand it today, really only dates from the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. States as we know them haven't always existed and may not always continue to exist, for example. And, what we accept today as being part of the system may not be accepted tomorrow as part of the system, or 100 years from now, or 500 years from now. So I kind of already mentioned the term discourse. What do we mean by discourse? Again, this is a term you'll come across a lot. Discourse is the process by which social constructs are socially constructed. Discourse essentially, literally means kind of a discussion, a conversation, not necessarily a conversation between two or more individual people, a verbal conversation, but rather the kind of bigger discussion within society, the kind of ongoing conversation collectively within society which creates and maintains the social constructs which all of us take for granted. And again, these discourses, and particularly the kind of dominant discourses, the dominant sets of ideas, the dominant ways of looking at things, these ultimately underpin power relationships in the international realm. And I'm sure we can think of lots of examples of that. So, for example, and we'll talk about this more when we get onto kind of the video on feminism, but the idea of women being subordinate to men, which has been the case in most societies worldwide throughout much of history. And of course, something which is, in recent decades has been challenged, and which feminism as a paradigm is seeking to challenge. But the idea that women were subordinated because of a discourse which said that, first of all, that gender roles are separate, that men and women play different roles, and that ultimately women are subordinate to men. And even women themselves, most women, not all women, even historically, but most women themselves kind of believed this also and acted accordingly. And it's because there was general acceptance of this unequal relationship that women have been subordinate, or have been subjugated, and have been subjected to this unequal power relationship. Feminists seek to change that by changing the conversation and by changing expectations of what women's roles are. So that's what we mean about discourse creating unequal power relationships. Or it may not be gender, perhaps it's racial inequality, again embedded in discourses around race and culture. Or perhaps it's class inequality, again, same thing. So think about how dominant sets of ideas, dominant discourses can create and maintain unequal power relationships. And again, there's a lot of common ground here with critical theory, and also with Gramsci, the stuff that we discussed in the last video. So yeah, discourse is language or writing that is bounded by certain rules, symbols, metaphors, ways of thinking. Language is very important because words are tools for ideas. Ultimately, we think in words, or words are vehicles for ideas, I should say. We think in words. And so by controlling the language, we control the way that people think. Again, subconsciously. The terms that we use, the very words that we use, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later on, but the very words that we use influence the way that we think. So, for example, the discourse around the war on terror. What is terrorism? Terrorism is a word which is not neutral. It is value laden. It is a loaded term. Again, I don't want to say too much about that right now because I'm going to come on to that a little bit later in the video, but that's a good example. Assumptions are inherent in language, and the language that we use reinforces assumptions. So again, if we think about the concepts that realists kind of use as the basis for their understanding of the world, so if we think about states and national identities, if we think about sovereignty, if we think about balances of power, realists treat all of those as though they were, again, natural kind of features of the system which are kind of inevitable and baked into the system. Constructivists would say that all of those are actually socially constructed and therefore are subject to change. In other words, if we live in a realist world, maybe that's because we believe that we live in a realist world. And so long as we think we live in a realist world, then we will live in a realist world, because that is the world that we create. So, and not necessarily just us as kind of ordinary citizens, but particularly leaders, the people who are in charge of states. If they think in these terms, if they think in realist terms, power politics terms, confrontational terms, balance of power terms, if that's the way that leaders think, then that is the world that they will create. So in a sense, realism becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Realists say that this is how the world is, and the world is that way, but only because everyone is thinking like a realist. Which is kind of, maybe takes a little while to kind of get your head around that, but it's an important point that constructivists are kind of making about the constructed nature of reality, and realism and traditional IR theory in a sense as being kind of part of the problem. A quote I often share with my students from Ian Manners, so again he's kind of coming from a constructivist perspective: the ability to define what passes as normal in world politics is the greatest power of all. So if you can set the norms, if you can define what the rules of the game are, that is the ultimate form of power. Okay, so under this broad heading of constructivism, there are various different constructivist scholars who take slightly different approaches, and some constructivists are more extreme than others, in that some constructivists, what we might call the thick constructivists, kind of put a huge amount of emphasis on the socially constructed nature of reality. People like Richard Devtak, for example, would kind of argue that there is no objective reality. The political world, the world of international relations, is based on a multiplicity, a vast, almost unimaginably vast multiplicity of experiences and perceptions and values and beliefs that kind of defy easy categorization. So very heavily emphasizing the socially constructed nature of reality, and focusing almost exclusively on that. But then also we have what we might call the thin constructivists, and they are perhaps more mainstream within IR theory. So the again, thick constructivists kind of focusing on the idea that reality is made up of a multiplicity of ideas and experiences that defy easy categorization. But the thin constructivists, people like Alexander Wendt also calls himself a social constructivist. They are kind of more moderate constructivists, if you like, in that they're still constructivists. They're still very interested in the role of ideas and discourses in creating the world, our understanding of the world, and ultimately in creating power structures and so on. As constructivists, they are obviously still very interested in that, but they also kind of recognise that there are some material facts, that there are some material realities, and I would certainly tend to kind of take that view myself. I think it's, we have to acknowledge that there are, I'm not a positivist myself, but I think we have to acknowledge that there are certain material facts and material realities which do constrain or influence what happens in the international system. So, for example, if I said that there are approximately 8 billion people on planet Earth, that's a fact. That's not a perception, a belief. It's not up for debate. There are 8 billion people roundabout on planet Earth. There aren't 12 billion, there aren't 6 billion. There are about 8 billion. If I said that the distance between Europe and the United States is around 5,000 miles, again, that's a fact. It's not 2,000 miles, it's not 10,000 miles. That is a fixed distance, that is a material fact, for example. If I said that the United States currently has a operationally available stockpile of around 4,000 nuclear warheads, that is a fact. It doesn't. The US doesn't have currently anyway 10,000. It doesn't have 1,000. It has around 4,000 operationally available warheads at this moment in time. That is a material fact. So some things are real. So geography is real, nuclear weapons are real, population figures are real. So some things are objectively true, and those things limit the possibilities. So, for example, if two countries are potentially looking at each other as rivals, and one country wants to know whether it can attack the other country, for example, if the country has ballistic missiles, but those missiles only have a range of 2,000 miles, and the opposing country is 3,000 miles away, then obviously those missiles are going to be useless in that scenario. Again, that's just a fact. That's a material reality. So geography matters, range of weapons matters. If a country is wanting to intervene in another part of the world, but they might have, say, for example, a large army, but they don't have a significant navy or transport capability, well, that's going to limit what they can do. No matter how powerful your military might be at home, if you can't physically transport it to the place you want to get it to be, if you can't project power, in other words, then that's going to limit what you are capable of doing. So these things are material realities, and I think it's fair to say, as Wendt kind of points out, that there is a material base which sets certain limits on what is and is not possible. Nonetheless, there is a whole other aspect of world politics which is based on social structures and understandings and values and beliefs and discourses and social constructs. So the material base is the foundation, but the socially constructed aspects of world politics are crucial as well in determining outcomes. So a good example of this, one I often use with my students, if the world kind of operated according to strict neo-realist logic, for example, if all that mattered were material capabilities, as realists assume, neo-realists assume, if all that mattered were material capabilities, then logically Canada should be very afraid of the United States. Because from a realist perspective, realists argue that if one state is more powerful than another state, then the weaker state is going to feel threatened by the stronger state. Well, Canada shares a massive border with the United States, and the United States is militarily and economically vastly more powerful than Canada, So logically, Canada should be really worried about the United States. But of course, Canada isn't worried about the United States. Why? Because the United States is perceived as an ally and a friend, and this obviously is based on history, it's based on past interactions, it's based on the fact that notwithstanding the War of 1812, but certainly for the past couple of centuries, Canada and the US have enjoyed friendly relations. They have been allies, they have fought on the same side, and so on. And so this perception of a friend dominates Canadian attitudes towards the United States. Or if you look at the United States itself, if we look at for example, the United States is very worried about North Korea having nuclear weapons or Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. The reality is that Iran doesn't have any nuclear weapons yet. North Korea has a limited nuclear capability, but it is only limited. On the other hand, France has a far more advanced and sophisticated nuclear capability. France has much more chance of hurting the United States with nuclear weapons than North Korea or Iran do. So why is the US worried about North Korean and Iranian nuclear programs but not worried about French nuclear weapons? And once again, the answer is obvious, that France is perceived as friend, ally, not a threat. So the kind of material balance of power stuff that realists insist is the be-all and end-all clearly is only part of the picture. Attitudes, perceptions, values, beliefs, etc., all of that make a massive difference as well. So Alexander Wendt, again, describes himself as a social constructivist, and his kind of seminal book, which came out in, I think it was 1999, is called Social Theory of International Politics. Now, again, you'll remember when we talked about neorealism, Kenneth Waltz's kind of seminal text from 1979 was called Theory of International Politics, and that sets out the main sort of tenets, the major points of Waltz's neorealist theory. It's not an accident that Wendt's book has a very similar title, because Wendt is directly responding to Kenneth Waltz and the other neorealists. So whereas in Theory of International Politics, Waltz is arguing that the world is based on material capabilities leading to power rivalries and so on, Wendt is responding and saying, actually, it's not all about material capabilities. It's about, very heavily that the world that we experience is based on social constructs, which is why he called his response to Waltz Social Theory of International Politics. So another phrase strongly associated with Wendt, which was the title of an article he published back in 1992, which was kind of his first big kind of breakthrough article, is the phrase "anarchy is what states make of it." And again, this is another direct response to kind of Waltz and the neorealists. Because again, realists or neorealists say that anarchy follows a certain logic, that in a system which is made up of nation states with no overarching government, a system of anarchy in other words, there will inevitably be certain logical consequences which follow from that. So again, in a world where there is no world government, there is no world police, where states have to look after themselves, look after their own interests, power politics, according to neorealists, is the inevitable result of that. power politics flows from the fact that it's not logical under conditions of anarchy. It's not logical to trust anyone, particularly if they're more powerful than you, or at least a rival for you in power. You can't be sure that they're not going to attack you, therefore you would be unwise to assume that they're not going to attack you. You have to assume that they are a threat. You have to prepare accordingly. And the only way to be sure is to be stronger than the other guy. So everyone's competing to be the strongest. This leads inevitably to power politics, to balances of power, to arms races, and in many cases to conflict. So according to Waltz, anarchy has these certain inescapable consequences. Wendt is basically saying no. Those consequences, power politics and so on, flow from our beliefs and our assumptions about anarchy and the consequences of anarchy. In other words, again, coming back to this this basic point, that if we believe we live in a realist power politics world, then that is the world that we will live in. That is the world that we create. But that is only the case because of our assumptions and beliefs. Realism is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If every leader, every state thinks in realist terms, then we will live in a realist world. But it doesn't have to be that way. So again, liberals, neoliberal institutionalists, of course, take a different perspective. They argue that under conditions of interdependence, states as rational actors kind of see cooperation as the rational choice. States cooperate, build cooperative structures, again, not out of altruism, not because it's the morally right thing to do, but because states as rational actors recognise that cooperation is the rational thing. So neoliberal institutionalists are also saying that anarchy leads to certain consequences, particularly under conditions of interdependence, just different consequences to the ones that neo-realists see as inevitable. But again, Wendt would say, well, maybe, cooperation is a possible outcome. Conflict is another possible outcome. It all depends on how we approach the situation. It depends on our underlying beliefs. If we are thinking cooperatively, then we will cooperate. If we are thinking conflictually, then maybe we'll fight. It all depends on our understanding, our attitudes, our beliefs. That is what Wendt means when he says that anarchy is what states make of it. Anarchy doesn't have any inevitable consequences. It can lead to war, it can lead to peace, depending on what we or what states and the leaders of those states make of it. So yeah, Wendt is in agreement that anarchy does constitute the international realm. That we do live in a world of nation states, although states are ultimately social constructs, but we live in a world of nation states, and there is no world government. That is a fact. But our cultural and historical and societal and political ideologies and beliefs and assumptions and values are going to heavily influence what that means. So again, I've already kind of mentioned how how the USA treats France as nuclear deterrent very differently to the way that it treats Iran or North Korean nuclear capability. I've already mentioned the fact that Canada doesn't feel threatened by the US, even though the US is much more powerful than Canada. On the other hand, Finland is quite worried about Russia. Again, based on Russia's past behaviour and current behaviour as well. So, if anarchy is a self-help conflictual system, as realists assume, that is only because states have made it that way. And the idea of national interest defined in terms of power, as Morgenthau put it. Again, that is an assumption, and as such it is open to change. So, in thinking about how constructivism might actually apply to real world politics, let's take the example of the Cold War. One of the reasons why constructivism kind of came to the fore in IR theory is because it was felt to offer an explanation as to why the Cold War came to an end. Now, of course, if we kind of take a realist perspective on the Cold War, the realism would kind of see the Cold War as a classic kind of balance of power confrontation. Realists would say that it was inevitable that the United States and the Soviet Union would view each other as a threat because they were the two biggest powers left after the Second World War, and so it was inevitable that they each would view the other as a threat, and this, particularly in the context of the new technology of nuclear weapons, this would inevitably lead to a nuclear arms race and all the rest of it. So realists would say, the explanation for why the Cold War happened is pretty simple. In terms of why the Cold War ended, realism is a little bit less useful in explaining that. But a realist would probably argue that the Cold War ended because the United States simply outcompeted the Soviet Union. The strength of the US economy was such that the USSR in the long run wasn't able to compete with the US, and because of that the USSR collapsed. That's not really a satisfactory explanation. It does have some merit, but anyone who is familiar with the events around in the years around the end of the Cold War and ultimately collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, anyone who's familiar with the events will tell you that it was a bit more complicated than that. And realism doesn't really deal terribly well with the end of the Cold War. So what might constructivists say both about the causes of the Cold War and the end of the Cold War? Well, for one thing, a constructivist would say that the confrontation was not inevitable in the way that the realist would see it. A constructivist would say that the hostilities existed because people on both sides had a certain way of thinking. They had a certain set of assumptions which led them to see the other as a threat. Again, realists would say that's irrelevant. Ideology doesn't matter. None of it matters. Just the simple power realities made confrontation inevitable. Constructivists would say no, it's not just about power realities. It's about perceptions and assumptions, and it's about ideologies and beliefs about national interest and so on. The US and Soviet leaders kind of being guided by realist assumptions, but also the clash of ideologies, liberal capitalism and democracy versus communism. A constructivist would say, you cannot get away from ideology and identities and clashes of belief systems in explaining why the Cold War occurred. In explaining why the Cold War ended, a constructivist would say because the people on the Soviet side, in the kind of Eastern Bloc more broadly, changed their way of thinking. They ceased to have confidence in communist ideology. They ceased to believe in the communist system, the communist system of government and governance and economics. They wanted change, and they came to understand or to believe that change was possible. For the first time, they came to envisage a different alternative to the Soviet system, and they ultimately rejected that system and rejected that, not just that kind of system of government, but also the ideology and everything that went along with it, and they embraced a desire for a different kind of future. And also, once that started to happen, and once, kind of Mikhail Gorbachev had kind of implemented his reforms, and things had started to change in the Eastern Bloc, the West also changed its way of thinking, because for the first time, they began to feel less threatened by the Soviets, and moved away from viewing the Soviets as enemies, implacable enemies, towards a desire for reconciliation. So on both sides there was this kind of change of heart and a shift away from the confrontational attitudes that had characterized the Cold War period. And again, I think there's something in that, without kind of going into it in huge depth, because it is obviously a complex period in history, a complex, very complex set of events. But I think there's something in that perspective. So let's take another example of a real-world political issue and think about how constructivism might apply to it. So let's take the idea of terrorism. What is terrorism? We might think we know what terrorism is. We might think that terrorism is an objective reality. Now, on the one hand, yes, the people that we call terrorists do exist and do have political agendas which motivate them to politically inspired acts of violence, and people lose their lives as a result, and that is a reality. That's an unfortunate political reality. However, the term terrorist is ultimately it's a label which we kind of choose to apply to some political violence and not other acts of political violence. We apply the term terrorist to certain actors, to certain groups who use political violence, and yet we don't necessarily use the term terrorism to describe other groups that also use political violence. The old kind of saying is that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And, yeah, it's an old cliche, but it's true. Who or what we call a terrorist does involve a subjective value judgment, as does the term freedom fighter for that matter. So, let's look at some examples. I mean, if we look at the French resistance during the Second World War. Now, again, we tend to see them as heroes because of who they were and what they were fighting against. Yes, they were, resisting the Nazi occupation of their country, so we see them as heroes. But if we look at what they actually did, their actions, involved guerrilla warfare, acts of guerrilla warfare which are remarkably similar to the kind of actions that terrorists or insurgents might use. Assassinations, blowing people up, blowing things up, acts of sabotage, and so on and so forth. A more recent example, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Now, in the 1980s, the Mujahideen were kind of the Afghan militia who were resisting the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union, of course, invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and during this period, the Mujahideen freedom fighters were portrayed as freedom fighters and as heroes in the West, because they were resisting the Soviets, and the West kind of armed the Mujahideen. But if we kind of look at the propaganda films which came out at the time, things like Rambo 3, and is a good example, portrayed the Mujahideen as these heroic freedom fighters against Soviet oppression. Fast forward, 15-20 years, and the same guys who had been the Mujahideen, there was a lot of crossover with the Taliban, or the groups supporting the Taliban. And after the US invaded Afghanistan in 2001, these guys resisted US occupation. But now suddenly, instead of being portrayed as freedom fighters, they were portrayed in the West as terrorists and insurgents. But it's the same guys. It's basic from their point of view. They're doing the same thing, resisting a foreign invader. Whether that foreign invader is the Soviets or whether it's the Americans, from the point of view of the Afghan fighters on the ground, they were defending their land against a foreign invader. But in terms of how the West portrays them, we've gone from portraying them as these heroic freedom fighters to portraying them as terrorists and insurgents. But it's the same guys doing the same stuff. The only difference is that they were fighting against us, the West, instead of fighting against the bad guy Soviets, as we saw it at the time. So this just illustrates the fact that the line between good guy freedom fighters and bad guy terrorists is not always clear cut. It's not necessarily about good guys and bad guys in terms of objective reality. It's more about where do we stand and what are these people fighting for. If they're people carrying out acts of guerrilla warfare for a cause that we agree with, then we label them as good guys and freedom fighters. But if they're doing the same stuff in support of a cause that we don't agree with, then we use the terms terrorist and insurgent and so on. So these are not neutral terms. And again, remember that constructivists are very interested in the use of language as vehicles for ideas. So yeah, the Mujahideen. Were they freedom fighters? Were they terrorists? It depends on where you sit. Another good example, Martin Luther King. Again, obviously political activist, key figure in the US civil rights movement, which fought for equality for black Americans in the 1960s. And today, King is pretty much universally seen as a heroic figure because of his role in the civil rights movement. But at the time, in the 60s, he was portrayed by the US government and by US government agencies like the CIA and the FBI. King was portrayed as a dangerous radical. They didn't quite use the term terrorist, but that was almost the implication. They implied that this guy is dangerous, that he is a religiously inspired lunatic, and that he is a threat to national security. And this, despite the fact, King in reality was, sworn to non-violence. He was a Gandhian. He believed very strongly in non-violent protest only. But despite that, he was portrayed as this huge threat to society and to national security. And of course, he was a threat. Who was he a threat to? He was a threat to existing elites, existing power structures, who maybe didn't want the status quo to be challenged, and so had a vested interest in trying to discredit someone like King. But again, if you kind of go with what the US government and its agencies were saying about him at the time, they were painting a very different picture of the man to the one that the history books give us today. So yeah, another good example of how The way that a figure is portrayed is not necessarily objective at all. And it kind of leads us on to the question: can states themselves be terrorists? Again, we tend to think of a terrorist as kind of a non-state actor, a non-state group. But if we stop and think about it, we look at some of the things that states themselves have done. Could those be described as acts of terrorism? A good example, and again, I'm not trying to be anti-American here, but I'm just pointing out that, what happened in Vietnam, and Agent Orange, and, the My Lai massacre, and, the free fire zones, the targeting of civilians, some of the stuff that went down in Vietnam was designed to terrorize the local population. And yeah, do we call it? I mean, again, we kind of see the US as being the good guys, but when we look at some of the stuff that they actually did, could it be described as acts of state-sponsored terrorism? If we look at Russia and Ukraine, if we look at what's currently happening in Ukraine, we look at the actions of, Russian troops in Ukraine, kind of summary execution of civilians, the use of rape as a weapon of war. Again, does that constitute a form of terrorism? The use of missile bombardment to try to break the will of the population, does that constitute a form of terrorism? If we define terrorism as the use of terror, the use of fear to try to achieve a political outcome, then arguably the Ukraine, Russia's actions in Ukraine fit that definition. But again, if we look at some of the stuff that the West has done, again, it's kind of, and again, I'm not in any way kind of condoning what Russia is doing in Ukraine. I'm not, at the end of the day, two wrongs don't make a right, and I'm not in any way condoning Russia's actions in Ukraine or making any excuses for them. But the Western powers, the US and the UK, have arguably done similar things within the last 20 years. If we look at the invasion of Iraq, for example, in 2003. So, if we, and again, I often put this to my students, and say, who am I talking about here? If I say, yeah, there is a leader who committed the following actions. This leader ordered the invasion of a sovereign state. This leader justified that invasion on the basis of spurious claims that have been shown to be entirely false. The leader's real goal was to bring about regime change and to overthrow the existing sovereign government of that state and replace it with a puppet government, a client regime. And in pursuing these aims, this leader initiated a conflict that led to the deaths of large numbers of innocent civilians. Is this leader a war criminal? And the answer is usually yes. And then, of course, I ask the students, who am I talking about? Who is this leader? And, of course, they mostly say Vladimir Putin. You're talking about Vladimir Putin. And yes, I could be talking about Vladimir Putin because all of these statements apply to Vladimir Putin. However, the same statements apply to George W. Bush and to Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, who invaded, together took the decision to invade Iraq in 2003 to overthrow the sovereign government of Iraq with the aim of installing a friendly government. The claims which were made about weapons of mass destruction and all of that stuff turned out to be spurious, turned out to be entirely false in actual fact, just as Putin's claims about Nazism and so on in Ukraine were false. So all of these leaders have, all of the previous statements that I've made apply to each one of these leaders. So who are the good guys? And again, I'm not excusing anyone's actions. I'm not saying that what Putin is doing is okay because we've done the same thing. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that the world is not made up of good guys and bad guys in the kind of simplistic way that propaganda would have us believe. So that's, just giving you a bit of an overview of constructivism and how constructivist kind of analysis might apply to international relations. Again, ultimately what I'm saying here is question the received assumptions, because very often, the issues that we face in the world, and again the power imbalances in the world, the inequalities, the social injustices that we faced in the world, are based in systems of ideas and dominant narratives and dominant cultures, dominant ways of thinking, and the only way to kind of break out of that and bring about positive change is to challenge those dominant ways of thinking, those dominant discourses. That essentially is the lesson that constructivism seeks to teach us. Hope you found this video useful. The next one will be on feminism. So I look forward to seeing you in that next video. Thanks for watching and see you next time.